Good. Dis maríomh go léir cháirde agus fáilte roimh go léir chuig léachtaí chundal 2008. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 6th annual Daniel O'Connell lecture, which this year will be given in the format of an interview. Our interviewee and our principal guest is Micheál Martin TD, leader of Fianna Fáil, leader of the opposition in Oireachtas Éireann. I suppose, like many national leaders, we feel we know Micheál, and that's a very original thing to say, but in any event, to say something also original, to quote Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. And so the people of Cork South Central, whom he has represented as a TD since 1989, I think know him better and best of all, maybe. And certainly Cork is his base. Without Cork, I suppose he wouldn't be able to develop into that great national politician he is. He has served as Lord Mayor of Cork, as some of you will know. He has been an alderman of Cork Corporation. And of course, he's also spent time in University College Cork, where he did his BA and his MA. And I heard him talking down in West Cork last week about his love of history, because of course he studied history in UCC, and while he was there he did an MA in history by dissertation, very interesting dissertation I think, which was later published as a book by the Collins Press. It was a book about the challenges and the complexities of the Civil War in Cork. It's not a very easy topic, but he certainly managed to present it with great insight and with great expertise. It was published by the Collins Press in 2009, and of course I'm now going to embarrass myself because I can't remember what the title of it was. Was it Freedom to Choose?
Freedom to Choose.
Freedom to Choose, that was it, yes. Okay, I thought so. That's my deliberate mistake for the day. Okay. So we, of course, as I say, he was elected as TD for Cork South Central 1989, and of course during the 1990s and thereafter he served in many senior ministries in the government. Minister for Education and Skills, Minister for Health, Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and Minister for Foreign Affairs. Now, of course, Irish people being Irish people and Kerry people are no different than everybody else. We have our opinions about these ministries, and we will be teasing out those opinions over the course of the next hour or so with the help of Olivia O'Leary. And I was thinking about how I would introduce Olivia, even up to about a half an hour ago, and I still am not sure how to introduce Olivia O'Leary, because Olivia O'Leary is also somebody that we know very, very well. And even though I've only met her about 3 or 4 times, Olivia is somebody I think that you feel you've known all your life, after about 5 minutes. She's one of those people. And of course, it's also a fact, of course, that for those of us of a certain age, we remember the many reports that Olivia did on many of the flagship programs of public affairs programs in RTE, and also, of course, in the UK, where she was part of the panel in Newsnight for several years. More recently, she has come back to broadcasting again, fronting the poetry program in RTE. But for me, I must say, one of the most delightful pleasures of the week is hearing her, I don't know what they're called, or the editorial letters or whatever. Gosh, I didn't think what I was saying was that important, Mary, but I believe you. But those editorial letters that she broadcasts on RT1 every week. And I don't mind admitting that when I leave UCD on a Tuesday, I always try and leave at a time to coincide with her broadcasts. And I do actually have a life, believe it or not. But this is actually something that's very important to me. There are wonderful kind of analysis of the foibles of Irish society, Irish politics, the quirks of Ireland, and they're absolutely a delight to listen to. And so we welcome Olivia here as our special guest as well. So I'd like to welcome our 2 guests, first of all, if I may. I'd also like to welcome Mary Martin, who is here from Cork as well, of course, and some of the Martin's friends who have braved the county bonds to be here. So welcome to you all. Welcome to Jerry Collins, who would have served, of course, with Micheál in Oireachtas Éireann. Welcome also, in particular, if I may say, to John O'Donoghue, who would have served with Micheál for so long in government. We give him a special welcome. So welcome to you one and all. I'm not going to go on any further except to introduce Olivia, who will introduce the discussion. She will take questions from you afterwards. She won't provide the answers, but she'll take the questions. So at this point, I'll pass it over to Olivia. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Is this working? Can you hear me? Thanks. I'm always nervous of microphones until I'm sure they're actually working. Micheál, you know the way at the beginning of a match in Wimbledon, the way they have sort of practice shots across the net and all that sort of stuff. So I thought I'd start with an easy one, okay, for you today until we get moving. And that really is your view of Daniel O'Connell.
Extraordinary colossus in Irish politics, and probably from a historic perspective, one of the most significant figures in terms of the evolution of modern Irish society. A person who was the first really, in European terms, international terms, to use the moral force of the people to leverage the popular will, so to speak, even though, and this was pre-extended franchises and so on like that. So that was an extraordinary achievement in itself. A man way ahead of his time in terms of his commitment to the rights of the citizen, and he saw Catholic emancipation very much in the context of the rights of the citizen, which is why he was hailed again. I mean, you're looking here at a true global figure, Irish global figure. I think it's fair to say that in the aftermath of our own independence, he was marginalised to a certain extent in the historiography of Ireland and all of that. I think it's coming back into his own. I was mindful of this morning's lectures. I think it was Martin Mansur made the point that O'Connell really begins what is a very significant Irish parliamentary tradition, really, in the broader sense, which carries us through a very difficult period during World War I, War of Independence, Civil War, the transition from Commonwealth to Fianna Fáil. Brian Farrell wrote about this, about the Irish parliamentary tradition, and O'Connell really has to be seen in that context, and that legacy is a very rich one for this country. Yeah. But he was the mentor to the anti-slavery movement and so on. An extraordinary individual, champion of women's rights, way ahead of his time, I would say, and someone we should be very, very proud of.
And yet he said that he didn't believe that progress towards improved rights, parliamentary reform, in fact, progress generally was going to be achieved by the use of violence. And he said even if it was achieved by the use of violence, the cost would not have been worth it. So when you celebrate 1916 or you go to celebrate Wolfe Tone, he wouldn't have been with you.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why he was, to a certain extent, after the War of Independence, marginalised. I mean, he was a pacifist.
Yeah, but come back to that, Micheál. I mean, you can't just say, he was criticised and he was marginalised. Yeah. Was it right that he was marginalised?
No, that's what I was coming to. No, it's not at all.
It was wrong that he was marginalised.
It was absolutely wrong that he was marginalised.
Was 1916 wrong?
Was 1916 wrong? No. Again, you see, you have to judge people in the context of their time. That's the great lesson of history when you look back at history. You cannot judge people by your modern day perspectives or look through the prism of today.
So, but Micheál, he said that military violence or parliamentary violence, paramilitary violence was wrong in 1820.
He witnessed the horrors of the French Revolution. He witnessed the horrors of 1798. He was very informed by the horrible realities of those bloodbaths, and that did inform his opinion. I mean, I would see myself as a pacifist. I mean, I'm a constitutional Republican.
But you celebrate 1916.
I do, because I see it as a
and you celebrate Wolfe Tone.
I see it as a foundational event in the modern state.
But Micheál, that makes no sense.
Oh, it does, actually. I mean, because it is a foundational event. I mean, you cannot but commemorate 1916.
How can you say you're a pacifist and regard paramilitary violence as the basis and the foundation of the state?
You use the word celebrate. I commemorate. I had grandparents who were in the War of Independence. That doesn't mean I sort of hail everything they did or didn't do. They were human beings with flaws as well. I mean, and what happened, throughout that period from about 1912 to the War of Independence was violence on a number of fronts. And again, many of these people responded as best they saw it in their time. And in many ways, yes, we do have to be careful. I don't think we should glorify violence at any stage. But equally, we have to acknowledge the context in which people operated in and what went on. But I think historically it should also be said, and this might, historically, the Irish War of Independence was one of the shortest ones. And indeed, the Civil War was even shorter. By European experience. No, I'm just making the point, we're not.
We killed, but only for a short time.
Well, we did. But I think it's an important point to make in terms of a balanced perspective on our past. And, as we evolve, as we modernise, I think we should look at our past, warts and all. And I've been at an earlier history symposium below in West Cork only earlier this month, where again we went through all of these of these issues, in terms of the Tan War, the operation of the Black and Tans, the extraordinary violence they visited in my own city, and the reaction from people. And very often we learn that how the state reacts, and O'Connell was conscious of this as well, and O'Connell's repeal movement was very much about let's not allow, if you like, people to become to lose faith in the institutions of the state, to lose faith in society, and to resort to violence and to other activities. And to a large extent, the British behaviour during the war in Ireland was a very significant catalyst for the subsequent War of Independence.
But Micheál, do you not see, and I'll finish on this, do you not see any ambiguity between admiring O'Connell's consistency in standing against the use of violence to achieve his political ends on one hand, and, I'll use your word, commemorating and remembering with great respect and fanfare 1916 on the other?
Well, ambiguity, is, as we learned this morning, can be the oil of many.
You're sounding like Brian Lennon.
Well, yeah, what the Brian said, the futility of consistency. Yeah. No, but the point is, they were discussing the Good Friday Agreement this morning, and tellingly very sad that locked in that agreement is very significant ambiguities, which allow the thing to happen and be delivered. Look, the point I'm making is I don't look back on the past. Here's my position, and I'm going to defend it on all fronts. I don't think you can look at history. We must not revisit history trying to justify where we are today, just trying to justify our modern day political narratives. History should never be used, in my view, or abused by the political narrative of today. I think there was too much of that went on in Ireland, and I think we should be in a position, which I think the 1916. I think you probably don't do it justice in some respects, because I thought the commemoration was very balanced, very structured, warts and all, and I think there was a variety to that commemoration, which gave us the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, but maybe some of us might look back on Daniel O'Connell, despite all the years that have passed in the meantime, and learn an awful lot of really good lessons from what he
100%,
stood for.
100%.
Okay. I'm rarely surprised by politicians. It's one of the problems that I have with politicians. But you have surprised me on a number of occasions recently. I wrote a column for the thing I do on the radio. At the beginning of all the Brexit discussions, asking, does nobody remember all the years of effort and toil that went into creating, first, the foundation of a really good Anglo-Irish agreement, and then based on that new understanding between governments and officials in London and Dublin, the building of a peace process in Northern Ireland, because I think it really did begin with the two governments coming together 100%. And saying, we're going to work together for peace, and we're not going to let anybody hold us hostage. None of the extremists hold us hostage. And then suddenly you were hearing people, getting a bit belligerent about the British and the position that they had, and you had both Simon Coveney, but particularly Leo Varadkar, saying things like, what was he talking about? We will never again desert Northern nationalists, and saying, we've broken with the British 4 times over the last century, and he mentioned all the times that we did it, including the last time, I think, on the currency, and saying we always emerged better at the end of it. And I remember thinking at the time, does he not know how many hours, weeks, years went into building a proper understanding, and that it ain't just to be thrown away in this way. And then a few months afterwards, I mean, you probably never heard that, Colin, you came out and you said pretty well the same thing. And I remember thinking, gosh, that wasn't the quarter from which I expected to hear Fine Gael be criticised for being too nationalist.
Or too simplistic.
What?
Or too simplistic.
Or too simplistic. But it was interesting because I felt what you were defending actually was as much Garrett Fitzgerald's tradition as it would have been Albert Reynolds and Bertie Ahern's and the efforts that they put into that. So just talk to me a little bit more about your fears of that precious relationship, both with Britain and the North.
Well, I would have felt that there's a degree of carelessness and recklessness to the language that's been used in those contributions that you outlined, both from the Taoiseach and particularly from the Taoiseach and indeed at times from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because the central underpinning of peace in Northern Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement and the Anglo-Irish Agreement is a trusting relationship between the two sovereign governments. I can recall Gerald Collins as Foreign Minister with Peter Brook. The emerging sense of that trust took a long time to build up. And notwithstanding the enormous threat that Brexit represents, not on social economic front, but also in terms of breaching that trust, undermining that trust, I think we all have an obligation not to casually throw away what is a key element and underpinning of the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement and the institutions that were created by it. And that would worry me. And
you think that there's a danger that that's what Leo Varadkar is doing?
Well, I think there's been too much megaphone diplomacy, as I would describe it. I think even in the context of the overselling of the December deal, to a large extent, we had a situation then where Theresa May was about to do the agreement with Donald Tusk, and we were out first, or I were out first saying we have agreement. And of course what happened was the whole thing got derailed, and then we got this complication which proved two irreconcilables were put into the deal. But I think that can be dealt with in the fullness of time. But I worry about what I sense is a relationship between Britain and London and Dublin that is not as strong as it once was. And I think both the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach need to work very strongly on that.
Did it ever strike you that Leo Varadkar might be trying to outflank you by sounding more nationalist than Fianna Fáil?
To be honest, that doesn't faze me at all.
You mean you don't think he'll be seen as more nationalist?
No, but it doesn't. That doesn't bother me.
Doesn't bother you, even if he is?
Sorry, that he's perceiving. I don't play those kind of games that someone wants to be more nationalistic than I want to be, or I'm going to prove I'm better than him on that question. That's just not me. I've proven my credentials in terms of, I negotiated the devolution of justice. It took a good year and a half. That was the final chapter, if you like, in terms of the Good Friday and St Andrews settlement. So I got up at close quarters, would have understood the need to build relationships on all sides, with Republicans, with SDLP, Alliance, DUP, UUP. I would have chaired sessions of all of them. And when you get to that level, it really is about the Wolfe Tone view of uniting Protestant, Catholic and the centre, and in the modern era everybody else, because it's a different society now. So I think I would have thought we'd move beyond the business of saying, oh, I'm a better Republican than him, or I'm a better nationalist than him, and I'm going to show it. I think we need to work on we need to build on what has worked in the past, but also be open to fresh initiatives and new ideas, because obviously what worked 20 years ago needs a new impetus and needs some degree of energy.
But do you suspect that that's what he's doing?
I don't know, to be honest. I'm not, if I think that would be a wasted. He would be wasting his time if he's going to do that.
Because he'll never be more nationalist than you are.
No, because the people aren't going to buy it. People don't buy that. I don't think people. I remember years ago being asked at a seminar, could you conceive of a time when Articles 2 and 3 will go? And I remember saying, it was in Virginia, long before the agreement, and I said yes. To the shock horror of people like yourselves and all the people who
wasn't there, Micheál.
I know, but people like, who would not expect it from this quarter. No, obviously, as Martin Mansell pointed out this morning, it was done in a proper constitutional reciprocal context where there was a quid pro quo on it. But my point being, I'm not afraid of sort of moving forward.
Yeah.
I'm not trapped by the tradition that I spring from. And as I would have said, from my maternal side, it was a very strong Republican tradition.
Yeah.
But in many ways, that gives me a self-confidence not to be bothered about someone trying to outdo you on some particular front.
Well, as well as representing, the many people who had put so much work into the building up, particularly of the London-Dublin and the Belfast-Dublin relationship, I remember wondering too, are we seeing here Fianna Fáil, which has always been the party of a Europe of the nations and very conscious of all the separate nations that went into making up the European Union, very like de Gaulle. Whereas Fine Gael always had, perhaps were always more open to the notion of a federated Europe. Was there anything in your mind that was afraid that, that vital relationship with Britain between one nation and another was going to get lost by Leo suddenly, embracing the European flag and the notion too of a federated Europe?
Not particularly. I mean, my criticism would be very much focused on the absolute imperative of nurturing the British-Irish relationship and not letting it wither on the vine, because it's too important, given our history. And we had arrived at a new era when we had a very good shared history and geography where we really had moved things forward. It is carelessness in the extreme to be taking risks on that for the sake of political rhetoric or political advantage. For example, when the talks collapsed on the restoration of the executive and the assembly, which I consider scandalous that they're still not up and running, the Taoiseach said he went north because he was told the Prime Minister was going north. And they both arrived, to the surprise of everybody it seems, and announced a deal that then got derailed because it was announced too prematurely. I was very taken back by that, because I would have expected there would have been tic-tacking, proper back channels going on, and that you wouldn't end up in a situation saying, well, because one is going, I better go. Yeah. You don't choreograph meetings of that kind without there being a solid basis for it, and you essentially almost knowing the outcome. Well, so that took me by surprise.
Looking at
as well.
Brexit, though, and the handling of Brexit, I mean, you've criticised the government. You said that they had put too much emphasis on the backstop. It was a comment that you made, and I wasn't quite sure what you meant. I mean, was it not terribly important that they did put emphasis on what was effectively securing a position against a hard border?
I mean, sorry, the language at the moment, by the way, is that we must now de-dramatise the backstop. So even Barnier is now saying that, Simon Coveney is now saying that. And I just asked a very basic question, well, who dramatised it in the first place? It certainly wasn't Urs or anybody else. Of course, the Good Friday Agreement, the fate of Northern Ireland in the context of Brexit is absolutely vital, of course. But equally, the British-Irish relationship, the British-European relationship is going to be central to our future as well, the future of the island. And that's where we're now seen to be moving towards, because we were told if there wasn't progress on the backstop by March, there wouldn't be any agreement, if there wasn't progress by June. And so that's all come and gone.
And Bertie Ahern said that they should not let any discussion on securing the position on the border go beyond June. He said, you're into terrible trouble, he said, if you do that, because they're all going to come at you at the last minute, all the other 26 nations in terms of a European agreement, and they're going to say, come on, guys, you're the only ones holding it up. Come on, let's sign it. And
that's a very real possibility now. No, it's not easy. And to be fair, I think our civil servants, both in the Department of Taoiseach and in Foreign Affairs, are excellent, and we're very good people at all levels on this issue. I think politically we need to be a bit more careful in terms of how we articulate where we're going step by step. In my view, I think you mentioned ambiguity earlier. There will be a fudge of some kind. I believe that there will not be a hard Brexit. I'm sticking my neck out. I don't believe there'll be a hard Brexit because that suits nobody.
But do you think the government has actually been too obdurate and too stubborn about saying we stick our heels in here?
No. I mean, there are issues within that in terms of for example, the citizen rights of the people in Northern Ireland. They're European citizens post-Brexit. Will be European citizens post-Brexit because of the Good Friday Agreement. So that European citizenship has to be vindicated. So of course the issue has to be addressed. But there is equally an argument, and to a certain extent the North is in the middle of this, both from a European side and a British side and the Irish side, in that Britain are saying we want to do benign, general agreement with Europe that takes care of the border, and that there will never be a need for a backstop. But I think we do have to, and we're collectively agreed on this, that we have to ensure that we don't have a border on the island of Ireland.
Micheál,
but the mechanism and the route through that is...
I'm not sure what you're criticising the government for.
Sorry, the backstop was oversold completely at the time, and it had negative implications in terms of the agreement. I mean...
That they said they had a hard and fast agreement on the border, and they didn't.
Yeah, well, we don't.
But if you were there, you would have tried to do the same thing.
Well, I think, actually, I would have put a bit more focus than it seems to me has been put on the British-European relationship. And there is a big challenge ahead in terms of what you're saying. I think it's all being lumped in together now. So the issue will be, because some Europeans are not as sympathetic to a positive arrangement between Britain and Europe. That's dangerous for us. We export heavily to the British market. Our agri-food industry is very dependent on it.
Yeah.
If you look at all the analysis, the Western Seaboard, the border counties will suffer very significantly if it's if it's a Canada Plus type trade agreement. If it's less than optimal trade agreement between Britain and Europe, then we suffer. There's no such thing as a good Brexit here. So I think we could be doing more in terms of trying to, as best we can within the European context, arrive at a situation where we have a better deal between Britain and Europe.
What if they crash out and there's no transition period, no long-term deal, no soft border?
I think there will be a transition period.
But what if there isn't?
And I think we're in deep trouble if there isn't. I think that will have very serious repercussions. Now, the other side of our criticism would be we need to be doing far more to prepare. And I was somewhat surprised it's only the last 2 or 3 months that government ministers saying we're no scenario planning for a no-deal Brexit.
Oh, come on, Micheál. They've been having preparation meetings. I've chaired a few of them. They've set up grants for people
all the
to
surveys,
prepare for Brexit.
if you look at all the analysis of SMEs across the country, it's frighteningly high level of small to medium-sized industries are not Brexit prepared. Not Brexit prepared.
But there are grants available.
There are grants available and so on, but the message hasn't gone through. I believe there has been a view that it'll be, that it'll be all right in the night amongst industry, among businesses, but there's a far greater need, I think, for a far greater degree of preparation on the side of business industry, if a no deal is to emerge.
And
but
if you were to bet on it now,
I mean, Europe is looking at 39 billion as well. So that's why, if you look at the essentials here, Europe doesn't want to break it up in a no deal scenario. So I believe there's going to be a lot of noise between now and October, maybe a bit beyond. And I think some agreement will be hammered out. It may be one that pushes it down the road a bit more. And that may be the best case scenario in the short term, not the optimal. But that, you create a general agreement declaration in October, which then leads to an agreement to negotiate the deeper details around the trade agreement and so on like that, because you're not going to do a trade agreement in 5 or 6 months.
And are you hoping by pushing it down the road or elongating the period that we might have a change of government, and we might even have a government that might have a second referendum?
Well, I'm not so sure about the second referendum, but certainly a political realignment in Britain that would be disposed towards a softer Brexit. I think that's our best bet, actually. And I think that the emergence of a more realistic government in Britain that really negotiates for what we call a softer Brexit is the best possible outcome. I'm not so sure that they'd have the confidence, the British politicians, to put the question again, or the certainty that they might get the outcome that they desired. They could have done more.
Stubborn people. Yeah.
They could have learned more from the Irish experience and how to run referendums, maybe. Yeah.
Indeed. Not as malleable as we are, maybe. The other time that you surprised me was when you decided to support the repeal the Eighth Amendment referendum and the government's draft legislation. Why did you do that?
Fundamentally, because personally I was more comfortable with the position I adopted in conscience. In 2013, we had decided as a party to allow people freedom of conscience when we had only 20 TDs, and that was in the context of the 2013 legislation to legalise for the X case, to draft legislation for the X case. And that created a better atmosphere in the party at that time in terms of people having that freedom. From my own perspective, it's been an issue since the 80s. And as I said in my speech, the 8th Amendment didn't stop abortion in Ireland, and the retention of the 8th Amendment wasn't going to stop abortion as a reality in Ireland. I think I was very taken by, about 2 years ago, I met four mothers who came into Leinster House. They were mothers who had fatal fetal, their babies had diagnosis of and then the abnormalities was discovered. Devastating for them. They wanted their babies and their children. And they described to me the journey to Britain and to have to bring back the remains in the boot of a car in a ship. And I more or less mentally, personally to myself resolved there and then, I'm not going to, when I get an opportunity, when this comes again, I'm not going to force women through that journey. Just couldn't. And when I was asked, and likewise in terms of rape and incest, I can't, in conscience, force women to go through pregnancies in those situations.
But so many of your party did not support you. Are you in the wrong party?
No. The other point I would make here is that, again, life is a continuum. One thing you learn as you go through life and politics is nothing is black and white. I talked to people during the referendum. We campaigned and we spoke to people, but it was a different kind of. You wouldn't be trying to browbeat people, or you listened to people really. There were people who voted yes reluctantly. There were people who voted no reluctantly. There was people agonising about it. But by and large, there was an overwhelming view that they didn't want the status quo to be retained. And so it's a difficult issue in itself. And I respect people within my party who would have different views to mine. There were a lot of people who were torn by the decision they had to take. And I respect that. And I think it represents perhaps a greater maturity in our political system. Within the Oireachtas Committee itself, which I think played a very significant role, it was probably an illustration of the new form of politics working.
Yes,
in
policy-based decision-making.
Billy Kelleher and Lisa Chambers in particular on that committee took a stronger position than other politicians in other parties did. So we can stereotype and brand overly as well. I mean, there would have been a large section of the Fine Gael party, for example, but who kept much quieter, who either abstained or voted not, as was their entitlement. So I think it's a learning curve too for us, because I don't think there was far greater tension, I'd be honest with you, maybe during this particular referendum than there would have been during the 2013 legislation going through the House. But it worked its way through, and I've had very good meetings with people afterwards. I've met every TD in the aftermath of the referendum, and we've gone through it. And they're very clear that they will not stand in the way. Even those who voted no will not stand in the way in terms of the legislation being put through the House.
Can we move on to housing? Because I know you've made a very big deal of how important housing is going to be in the renegotiation of the arrangement with the government, and maybe long term looking into an election. I'm just thinking of your spokesman on housing. I think he is, isn't he, Darragh O'Brien?
Oh, yeah,
and he claimed that the Taoiseach and the housing minister are failing to solve the housing crisis due to their, I quote, elitist and, I quote, cosseted backgrounds. Do you think that sort of name-calling adds anything to the housing debate?
Well, look, I'm not a great...
The posh boy.
Well, I think the main point, I don't think they get the urgency of this.
Because they're posh boys? No,
I'm not saying that. I don't get into name-calling myself.
You just get Darragh to do it for you.
Very... well, look, it's, what is it? I have a different leadership style to former leaders of the party. So I allow a bit of toleration of different styles and approaches to come out. But fundamentally, what annoys me about the housing is my sense of the lack of urgency. I still attend, I have clinics in my own constituency. I've never seen it as bad over the last 5 to 6 years. It pains me when young mothers come in, they're told they've got to get out in 3 weeks' time. We have no emergency accommodation on hand, nowhere to go. There's real terror distress, parents feeling they're leaving down their kids. And I look at the amount of state land we have, and I'm saying, like Fianna Fáil did it before in previous eras. This state, in much poorer times, had the capacity to build houses.
Yeah, but listen, Micheál, Fianna Fáil were in government in the 2000s.
30s and the 40s
and I
and the 50s,
remember
50s.
as a reporter sitting in the Dáil press gallery and looking down at Bertie Ahern explaining with those wonderful, sad spaniel eyes, that he has, explaining how terrible it was that they couldn't get the developers to deliver the 20% of social housing that they were required to by the Planning and Development Act of 2000. And wasn't it terrible that they couldn't get it? And sure, it was terrible because the Constitution had these private property laws, and sure, wasn't it awful that he couldn't do anything about it? And I remember looking at him and thinking, you are a Fianna Fáil Taoiseach. And you're a disgrace. I can't imagine previous Fianna Fáil Taoiseachs of previous generations who believed in public housing campaigns, in the local authorities getting down and doing it. I can't imagine them actually approving of that position. And I remember thinking, this isn't Fianna Fáil, not certainly as one has known Fianna Fáil of the past. How did you feel about that situation where effectively in those years the supply of social housing was pushed further into the private sector? And even at a time where we were supposedly having the record growth rates that any country had in the European Union, and we were in the middle of a boom and whatever, and there was a housing shortage then as well, Micheál. I mean, there's something deeper going on, and it has to do with who builds the houses. Why can't we go back to the local authorities and say, the buck stops with you guys, build the goddamn houses? Instead of having created a situation where they've lost all the building skills, they feel that they're much too posh to do things like building local authority houses anymore, where we're selling off the local authority stock, hand over fist instead of keeping it, and where we still haven't done what Judge John Kenny said in the 70s. Would you put a sort of a cap on that all development land could only be sold basically for agricultural price plus 25%, so that you would cut out the possibility of, windfall gains? Sorry, long question.
That's a lot. I was going to ask you to join us for a second. When you run for election.
But you had a proud,
and the reason I'm asking you is,
record.
Between 2002 and 2012, Fianna Fáil built 35,000 local authority houses. And there would have been another, I think, 12 to 15 under the approved housing, the social houses. So there was a lot of social houses built in that period.
But not enough.
Not enough, but way ahead of what's going on at the moment. You're right about local authorities, because I think
1975, local authorities built 9,000 houses.
Look, I'm with you.
Last year they built about 1,000.
I think a policy emerged within government, and I think it's still there, that does not want to build local authority housing. Now, I think the state should get involved in building both local authority houses and affordable houses. We had an affordable housing scheme in 1999 that was got rid of in 2012. And that housed thousands of people. Now, I talk about people who were above the income threshold to be eligible for a local authority house, but who can't afford the crazy prices at the moment in the market. And we urgently need, which we'll be putting forward to the next budget negotiations, an affordable housing scheme that's well subsidised, that enables working people to buy houses at an affordable price. The market has failed. It's dysfunctional. And the state needs to get involved, not just on the local authority front, but also on the affordable housing front. Furthermore, may I say just at the other point?
Did you agree, though, with the pushing of the building of social housing?
Can I just come back to the
You
Kenny?
were a member of those cabinets.
I'm now the leader of the party, and I'm going to direct it in a certain direction.
And did you protest at the time?
We built 35,000
Well, that was over quite a long period.
But can I just come back to the Kenny report, which you raised? And I think that is another important point. I would support a constitutional change to implement Kenny. I don't think there should be windfall profits once the land is zoned. Now, Jim O'Callaghan is working on that. That's something we're going to bring forward. Because I do think, and I come back to your question about the urgency of this, I think the numbers that have been trotted around in terms of what we're going to build this year and next year, the state was even overestimating the number of houses that were built for the last 5 years. The figures, the CSO had to correct them and so on like that. So I think, and if it needs a national delivery agency to get the houses built then so be it. But it is the greatest crisis facing us right now in terms of the cohesion of our society. The young people today are working flat out. They're going to cities to work. At the end of the week, they have very little to spare. Why? Because they're paying up to 35 or 40% of their income on rent.
Yeah.
They're on a treadmill.
Yeah.
And I feel for the younger generation more than any other generation.
Micheál, this
who
didn't
are
happen today nor
But
yesterday.
no, I'm talking about solving it now. Look, people want it solved now and into the future.
But
They
you
don't want-
accept your party's role in having pushed social housing further into the private sector, and therefore, I mean...
You
know,
mean
when-
in terms of the section or the Part 8s and all of that?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the 20%. But I was trying to get more, to leverage more local authority houses and to try and get a better mix.
Yeah, I mean,
that was
no-
part of a philosophy at the time, that instead of the massive, local authority housing,
Yeah,
that
the
we get a
ghetto.
mix across, better
Yeah,
integration.
Yeah,
and so on
and
like
Noel Dempsey started with the right idea.
He had a very
and
honourable and noble idea in that
and then
respect.
Martin Cullen took over, and whether it was that he had a lot of builder friends or that the party had a lot of builder friends, he watered down the requirement, and he said, yeah, lads, you can actually pay the local council's money, and therefore you don't have to mess your
Yeah, that was- in
beautiful
my view,
new
that was-
housing
that was a
estates
mistake,
with
yeah.
social.
Yeah, that was wrong. That was
Yeah.
a mistake. But I think I'm interested now in trying to resolve the
Yeah, I just
or
wanted an admission of guilt, that's all.
Oh, don't worry,
Micheál.
we're good for that.
Looking to your position on what might happen after the next election, you've made it clear that you won't go into government with Sinn Féin.
Yes, yeah.
And yet you would expect unionist parties in Northern Ireland to go into government with Sinn Féin. Isn't there an inconsistency there?
No, I think the Northern Ireland context is much different to the Republic.
Why?
Because of it was a state that was fundamentally, has been, and prior to the Good Friday Agreement, that depended on a contrived, if you like, political arrangement in terms of power sharing because of the conflict, because of, since the foundation of that state, various communities didn't have confidence in the institutions of that state, and we had all of the issues that arose from that. And therefore, out of necessity, in terms of the northern context, we had to say to the parties, we want a shared arrangement to bring the communities together. It's a unique form of government in the north because it's born out of the history, the specific history of Northern Ireland. And there's no other way, in terms of trying to build trust between different communities and different traditions.
But I've had
then
unionists say to me, reasonable people, within the last 2-3 weeks, very passionately, they've said, we've heard Micheál Martin, for instance, say that he ain't going to go into government with Sinn Féin. And yet you expect us, the people who were the target of so much IRA slaughter, to go into government with the very same people. It doesn't make sense.
Well, unionism signed up to the Good Friday Agreement in the end, with all of that entailed, because I think they realised that the only future was a shared future between the different communities and the different traditions. The Republic has a much different evolution, has had a much different evolution in terms of politics and the parliamentary tradition and the parliamentary system. And I do have issues with Sinn Féin in terms of, on a number of fronts, but in essence, that centralised control that is wielded over the party. And it's extraordinary in terms of the European sense. No contest for the leadership, for example, either in the North or in the Republic of the party. The degree to which people who are not elected by the people exert control over the party. That is a real issue. And it's very noticeable in Leinster House and so on that Sinn Féin TDs are, you get the sense that they're controlled by their party, that the apparatus of the party is very much in control, as opposed to TDs and other parties, very much answerable to the wider electorate. Sinn Féin comes first, the electorate second in terms of their deliberations.
And
then the final point is
shadowy figures
I
in the background.
Well, they are there.
Army Council, whatever.
Well, we didn't say that. That was said by security forces, the PSNI, and everyone has said that. That is a reality as far back as 2 or 3 years ago. But equally then, Sinn Féin, and we talked about history earlier and the propensity to impose one's current situation on history. I mean, Sinn Féin want us all to accept a narrative of the past. They want us to become apologists for the most horrendous crimes. And I'm not going to let that happen. And I'm very determined to make sure that they're called out in certain aspects. And they do need to not be apologists for what happened
So
and trying to say it was all justified.
So what would you expect them to do? And this is a genuine question. If Mary Lou MacDonald came out and said, you know, an open apology for what happened, for the Republican movement's involvement in it, which Sinn Féin was part of the Republican movement, for all that slaughter, and an apology which didn't do a whataboutery thing, you know, like
I think that would be very significant progress. Yes. Yeah.
So
I mean, but I'm, you know, that would be
that
I
sort
think,
of separation of the present parliamentary party from the slaughter of the past.
Well, I mean,
how would that affect your readiness to go into
I
government?
watched a film on John Hume recently.
Yeah.
Okay. And Eamon McCann at the end of that film,
Yeah.
there's a brilliant comment in it when he says, if you do the tours of the Bogside at the moment, he said, John Hume has been written out of the equation. So, you know, that's a very significant issue. And I think Sinn Féin want to create a new narrative about what happened in the last 30 or 40 years. And I think that has to be challenged. And I think they should be less hung up about that and far more open on it than they have been to date.
So if the leader came out and made a very definite division with the past and said that she apologised for what had been done and that there was no excuse for what had been done, that would affect your view in terms of going into government. I think that would be
a very significant development, and that's something I would consider.
And encourage her to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
The confidence and supply agreement, and you're going to be talking about it after the budget. What do you want in order to continue that agreement?
Well, what are the big issues facing the country? Where has the government demonstrably, in my view, failed? Well, we've just discussed housing. Health. The health services are in deep, deep trouble. The morale within the workforce in health at all levels is very low. And then thirdly, I mentioned that whole area, referenced the huge challenges facing the younger generation and the cost of living that they face. And that is a growing issue for young people who are working when they leave college. And the sense of, like, I think the age now by which people will own their own homes has gone up to about 35. So there are real issues there, and the costs associated with just living in cities and working. The divide between the cities, if you like, and particularly Dublin and the rest, is very stark, and rural Ireland in particular.
Post offices. Will post
offices are symptomatic of a wider issue in terms of how do we rebalance the economic development on this island, and it's one that isn't being properly grappled with. Broadband is, in my view, a key enabler for industry and business in rural towns across the country. Yet we're nowhere near, the contract being awarded. I mean, 3 years ago, I sat down when the confidence supply was being negotiated. I met the officials in the department with some of the independent TDs, and we were told on that occasion that the broadband tender would be going out that autumn. And it hasn't gone out yet, and the two major players have pulled out. And that to me, again, is symptomatic of a very, very sort of lack of urgency around kickstarting rural Ireland. The Dutch experience is interesting, and look at Trump in America and what happened with Brexit. When communities feel left behind, you're going to get alternative politics emerging. I think there is a clear emergence of a situation where large tracts of rural Ireland feel left behind and don't see concrete, tangible policies emerging to correct that. Now, we were derided correctly in terms of the McCreevy-Harney decentralisation sort of announcement, but prior to that announcement, there was some very effective decentralisation undertaken. That's just one example where the state used its instruments, if you like, to create permanent economic activity in areas like Carrick-Slieveen. So the Legal Aid Board is in Carrick-Slieveen, for example, is an illustration. Now, I don't believe in wholesale, but I'm just making the point that the state has to start thinking around how do we create a state presence in communities that feel they are being left behind, and use that as a catalyst to bring in other developments.
So you'll be looking for something, perhaps on post offices, something that affects the urban-rural divide. You'll be looking for something on housing. And how?
Sorry, could I just say that the first step in this is the budget? Okay.
Yeah.
We will then review the confidence and supply agreement, and we're committed to engaging with the government then towards November on that.
On that.
Yeah.
So do you see this going on to the end of 2019?
At this particular juncture, I'm fixated on the budget and those
But
thoughts.
you've
I'm not
also-
going to give hostage.
I know, Micheál, but you've also said that you wanted to supply stability, that was part of the reason that you did what you did. And I mean, you must have been blushing when Michael Creed at Bail na Blá heaped praise on you for how very responsible you were being.
Liam must have given him a phone call.
Must have given him a phone call. And I'm just wondering, I mean, if you believe in stability, as you obviously have up to now, you'd probably give them what, till the end of 2019?
Let's give credit where credit is due. Fianna Fáil has, since 2016 general election, facilitated the formation of a government and has given the country a stable political arrangement, which no one predicted, and everyone said cynical Micheál and cynical Fianna Fáil will pull the plug as fast as they can when they have Fine Gael over a barrel on some issue. We could have, and we didn't.
And you didn't.
And the reason is because of my experience of the 1981-82 period. Well, I wasn't a TD then. I was in university then, UCC, but there were 3 elections, and I was campaigning in those 3 elections in North Central at the time. I didn't have to cop on to realise I might be standing in South Central. But anyway, the point being, that was huge. That was not good for the country, and that has stayed with me. And I do believe after a general election, there's an obligation to provide the people with a government. Now, we stood up to the plate. We negotiated a confidence and supply. But it's not a blank check. It's not carte blanche, say you can go on forever. There has to be has to be tested against delivery, and there are issues that emerge during the course of that government. And what we're simply saying is those issues are alive, they're there, and it's no slam dunk, is what I'm saying to you.
No. So given satisfaction,
but Brexit is a factor.
Given satisfaction on those issues, would you be minded to let it run on to the end of 2019 or even into 2020? I mean, that's what Fine Gael desperately want you to do.
Well, I thought Fine Gael desperately wanted an election this September.
No, I don't think you were right.
Oh, I think that's what they were looking at, and the word is that Owen Murphy and Simon Harris want to get out of housing and health as quickly as they possibly can. Now, this is what's reported by other ministers. Who am I to question the impeccable sources that the Irish Times and others have, and the Irish Independent, with the government sources and so on like that. So I think we've managed to maintain stability in the context of significant degree of volatility within the Fine Gael ranks. So.
Okay, one or two more questions. Why didn't
But I
you?
think, could I just say to you, the Brexit thing is a factor, and
Yeah.
I think the country needs steady, hands at the tiller when Brexit is going. So that's a factor in the back of my head.
And anyway, why not let Leo make the mistakes while you sit back and blame him? De Valera's book, this is what could happen. Why didn't you run a candidate in the presidential election?
Because I feel, personally, I think Michael D. Higgins has done a very good job. I don't believe that we should run candidates for the sake of it. I don't think the presidency belongs to any political party. I believe he has demonstrated a great capacity, an intellectual capacity. He's engaged with young people. He's culturally, in my view, very strong for the position in terms of his command of the Irish language. His previous experience as an arts minister in terms of culture and so on. I think he gets a lot of what makes the country tick. I watched him recently at the national commemoration of the famine in UCC, where he spoke passionately about the famine. He interrogated the research that UCC Geography Department did. I went away that day saying, I watched the audience reaction. They loved what he served up in some respects. I think he has served with distinction the country internationally and domestically. I think he was particularly good in the 1916 centenary, and I think he is perhaps, in my view, and it's my own personal view, best placed so far among the candidates that have come forward to deal with the forthcoming commemorations of the War of Independence,
but what of those,
the end of World War I, the Civil War and so on.
What of those, and there would be many of them within your party, who feel that the party has maybe lost its unique profile a bit during this period of propping up the government, and who would have felt that the presidential election would have been a perfect opportunity for the party once again to showcase its wares, make it clear what it stood for?
Sometimes people make simplistic observations about politics and electoral politics. I would argue
Thank you, Micheál.
No, I don't mean, well, even those within, my point being, I don't think there's any correlation between a presidential election and a subsequent general election. And that's my very strong view.
Look at Dick Spring and the Mary Robinson win
Look
back
at
in 1990.
look at Michael D. Higgins's win and Labour Party's electoral performance in 2016.
Yeah.
So there are different factors that give rise to why certain results will happen. I'm just not convinced that the presidential is one. I think people actually in Ireland make up their own mind on the presidency. They look at the candidates. By the way, they'll only start to harden their position with about a week or two to go. And they'll simply ask themselves one basic question: who do we think can represent Ireland best on the international stage and domestically? They go with their gut
Then
in terms of who they think will represent us best. That's my
they vote well.
simplest
They vote well in
yeah.
presidential elections. Just one last one before I go to the audience. Then, next election, no matter how much you like looking to the future, and I always notice it with Fianna Fáil canvassers, when I go out with them on the canvas, they'll say to the canvas team, now remember, we're talking about the future, the future, the future, the future, and this was particularly the case in 2011. But in the next election, you know, people's memories are long enough, and inevitably you'll be tagged as being part of the Fianna Fáil cabinet which brought the country to its knees financially. So in 2002, when things started really to be pushed off the rails because exports were beginning to slow down, but what we had was the creation of a domestic consumer boom, which was what led partly to the problems that we faced when the actual bust came. Did you urge caution at Cabinet when there were all those giveaway budgets?
No, I think, and I've said this publicly, we got that wrong. And fundamentally what we got wrong was we spent too much and we reduced the revenue base too much. But the crisis was fundamentally a financial and banking crisis, and a global financial and banking crisis which took over the sovereign. I mean, I'm not saying that, international economists say that, but it was compounded by our mistakes here in terms of the domestic boom. Now,
And the way we encouraged people to buy houses. I mean, do you know what we were doing? We were actually subsidising and giving tax breaks to people who were buying holiday apartments in Bulgaria. It was mad.
Yes, absolutely.
It was bonkers.
And
you're a sensible man.
but
And were
also-
you not standing up at Cabinet and saying this is bonkers?
every economic indice we got at the time was telling us that we were doing all the European stuff, all saying you're doing fine.
Saying you're doing right to subsidise people buying holiday apartments in Bulgaria.
That's not it. But I thought the macro sense of the economy. There was no sense. I mean, we were putting 1% of GDP away a year. 1%. I remember we were lashed by Fine Gael and the Labour Party for creating the National Pension Reserve Fund. Now, it's probably the most conservative fiscal thing to be done in the history of the state. Now, it was in a time of plenty, and it was done partially to make sure we didn't spend even more than was being spent at the time. But
hollow laughter if you're suggesting that you were a financially conservative government. The evidence, unfortunately, is there.
But the point is, there was 1% of GDP was put away every year. Never happened before. No, we still spend too much in terms of government spending, and we reduced taxation too much, in my view. And that compounded our capacity to deal with the wider crisis that occurred in 2011.
It did win you 2 elections.
We probably would have won them without it, because I think Fine Gael lost the 2002 election. If you remember, they made more outrageous promises in advance of the thing. No,
Damn it, you could have won it anyway. You needn't have spent the money.
But look, the Labour Party before 2011 and Fine Gael could have won that election if they said nothing. And they promised the sun, the moon and the stars. I remember it well, universal health insurance, money follows the patient. Like, we all have to learn lessons from that kind of politics.
Do you think you've learned the lesson?
Yes, I have, yeah. I've heard Shane Ross going on about a granny grant, for childcare. I mean, has anyone stood up and said, are we learning lessons? I think if we're doing anything on childcare, we have to fund the capacity in childcare. Like people working in the creches or in early childhood schools, for example, not being paid anything near teachers. So why would you do a degree in early childhood studies now if you're on the minimum wage when you come out afterwards? So that's where, if you're going to put additional resources into childcare, that's what you do. But what Shane Ross is doing is to do what was done in the past, and we did a bit of that, and it was wrong. But I think it's extraordinary that so many years after a crash, we're nearly back to that. I would also put in, and I'm not an economist, I think the fact that we're an open economy is problematic too. We're a very small economy. We're very FDI dependent. and I was in enterprise for 4 years, and I worked at trade missions for both indigenous and for multinational investment coming into the country. And I did a lot in terms of research and development, which I think strategically is where we must invest more and more to develop our own ideas that develop our own home industries, because I think the FDI model that has been very successful for 40 to 50 years is under threat from a combination of Trump economics, which is he's making it from a taxation perspective far more attractive now for multinationals to go back to the States and maybe slow up in investing overseas. So I think there's a moment when we need to now radically look again at our industrial policy in terms of making sure that we can rebalance that equation. And I think we are very much because
Rebalance
we're
it
open
more in terms of
indigenous.
encouraging indigenous
Yeah,
industry.
yeah.
Okay.
But I just think the open economy thing needs a bit more analysis. The boom-bust cycle, is it totally under the control of politics and the political system, or is it something that's going to be natural to our model?
Okay.
And I think that's something we've got to interrogate a bit more and be straight up with the people on it and face up to it.
I've taken loads of time because it's been really enjoyable, by the way. But can I now open the discussion to the floor in terms of any question anybody would like to ask? Yes, Paddy, yourself. Have we got a roving mic or not? We do have a roving mic. If you can just hang 1 second, just because people at the back mightn't be able to hear you. So it's Paddy Bush along here.
Thanks. I asked the question in the light of what you said about Michael D's suitability for presidency and also in the stated commitment to rural Ireland. The question is, in government, would Fianna Fáil discover a commitment to the arts and rediscover its commitment to the Irish language?
Well,
Great
you say
question.
rediscover. I think Fianna Fáil has a very strong legacy in the arts. I think John O'Donoghue, for example, was one of the most effective ministers for the art that we had, and indeed sport, that's a fact. I think Sheila Devil, in terms of, and what you will get from us, I'll be honest with you, and one thing I'm concerned about at the moment in arts policy, and that relates to the creation of Creative Ireland as well, the creeping political intervention and control and interference with arts policy. We established the Arts Council to make it independent from politics, and that politicians wouldn't be making decisions on grants to the arts to suit themselves electorally and locally. That has now started again, and it should stop. And I will absolutely commit, because I'm very committed to one of the nicest positions I ever had, was chairman of the Arts Committee of Cork Corporation. And I loved working with artistic bodies and communities. Why? Because they made money go a long way. A 10,000 grant, 5,000 grant, they worked miracles with it. So to me, yes is the unequivocal answer on the Arts Fund. Indeed, Smith is our spokesman on the arts. She's an arts educator herself. And prior to becoming a TD, she was the education officer for the VC in the Cavan Monaghan area. And in terms of rural Ireland, I am very committed, but trying to do more tangible. So I would actually look at, I would review certain areas of state activity that could be carried out in rural Ireland. I'd also go to the companies again. I think too many companies have just followed the trend of saying we must go to Dublin, and because it's where all the young people want to be and so on like that. I mean, Fexago here, for example, is a very good illustration that you can create employment in rural Ireland. Allergan in Mayo. Allergan is the world centre for Botox manufacture in the world. And Botox has multiple uses. And that's up on Westport. So I think, and we built motorways, and I'm concerned we built the motorways, and to be frank, the motorways, contrary to what we might have thought, have actually accelerated the moves to the cities and the centres, and haven't had the reverse. I thought they would have made rural areas more accessible, hence industries might have been more prepared to locate.
They let people get out of there faster. But what about the part of the question that refers to the Irish language?
Sorry.
I mean, I think the point that was being made was,
the language is still...
are you going to rediscover your commitment to the
I don't think we've
language?
ever lost our commitment to the language. I think we're actually in the confidence to supply the one glue. I mean, if you talk to Conor na Gaeilge, they appreciate the work we've been doing in the last 2 to 3
But
years
if you look
to
at
get
an
budget
area,
increases for,
if you
for
look
the
at an
Irish
area
language.
like this, say I went to Ballinaskelligs as a youngster at a time when people spoke Irish in Ballinaskelligs. The last time I went there, nobody who spoke to me spoke
Irish.
in Irish. Yeah.
But on the other hand, you can go into urban communities now where Gael Scoilina have flourished, and we were very strong in recognising and developing Gael Scoilina.
But if you lose the Gaeltachts, Micheál,
you do, but we have to spread it beyond the Gaeltachts as well. And there are issues around how Gaeltacht sustain the language in the global sort of communications revolution that we've experienced, you know, and there are issues, and I don't have all the answers to that.
Does
But I
issues
do
mean
think-
that you
but I
don't
think
look
teach-
to the Gaeltacht anymore as the source?
Well, it is it is the well from which
Yeah.
springs much of the literature heritage and all of that. But equally, you know, I actually can have conversations in Irish now with young people in the city of Cork that I wouldn't have been able to have 10 or 15 years ago. They've come through the Gael School model. They're not even doing Irish now. They're quite competent and fluent in Irish. So let's not underestimate the growth on a lot of fronts as well.
Are
Olivia,
you
know?
not deeply concerned about what's happening in the Gaeltachts?
I am, but I think the Irish
You don't
language was the
sound
issue.
it.
Well, sorry if I don't sound it, but I am. Okay. I
Okay. Okay.
But I'm making the point that the language has to be wider than just the Gaeltacht. And I think TG Cahir, I think Radi na Gaeltacht are the way to go. And I think we should independently fund TG Cahir, ring fence it, and make sure it has a sustainable future. And I think stop RT from poaching all the good stars from TG Cahir.
Yourself, just wait till we get a microphone up to you. Sorry, I'll come to you in a minute. There's somebody with a microphone there, so off you go. Oh, she doesn't have a microphone. It's her glasses case. I didn't think it. But I will bring you in, okay?
You showed a fine historical sense of how people should be judged in the context of their own times. O'Connell as a pacifist in his day, and the violent leaders of the 1916 rising in their times. One could be forgiven for missing the same kind of attitude, or even a trace of it, in recent discussion in Ireland in connection with the Pope's visit, for example, where things became particularly hysterical. I stay away from the thornier issue now of sexual abuse of children and so on, but how people were treated in institutions, for example. You could say I was in institutions myself. I was a primary and secondary pupil in Irish schools from the late 40s up to about 1963. And there were people, if not myself, in the environment that were pretty savagely beaten now and again. And it's not because the teachers involved or the institutions involved were fiendish. It was just the way things were then. And these things should be judged as well, at least with a modicum of the same kind of admirable attitude that you show towards O'Connell and others.
Okay.
Well,
Brian?
just on that, I mean, I was the minister that initiated the inquiry into the industrial schools. And it was known as the Lafoy Commission to begin with, and then became the Ryan Commission. And I recall reading a memo from an assistant secretary in the Department of Education. I think it might have been around 47. He was appalled at how the cattle were better fed than the children in Dangan. And he recorded that in a government memo at that time. And one of the things we did, actually, we created a history. We brought someone from Trinity to go through all the archives on the industrial schools. So we had to interrogate that. We had to inquire into that. I would have met the late Christine Buckley and Bernadette Fahy from Golden Bridge, heard their stories. They were real stories of today. They bore the scars of those institutions on them as people. They cried out for justice. And I'm glad that we were in a position at that time, in 1999, to do something about that. And I think we had to do something about that.
Yeah.
And the same applied. I would have initiated inquiry into Ferns. At the time, it was the first inquiry into diocesan child sex abuse. It was an appalling story. In fact, George Birmingham, I think we appointed first to do a scoping study on that. I think all of that had to happen. But equally, the state has to do its bit too. And so I'm very critical at the moment, and we would have been negligent as well in terms of, for example, children in primary schools. There are people at the moment who can't get access to a redress scheme. The European Council of Human Rights, Court of Human Rights, pronounced in favour of Louise O'Keeffe. Yet the government have narrowly defined that to exclude up to 200 and odd people who were sexually abused in primary schools. So I don't think it's on for the state to say to the church, you must get your act together if the state doesn't work to get its act together.
Okay, I'm going to take one or two questions together. There's somebody back here, but this man, I've been pointing to him for about a quarter of an hour.
Sorry.
So would you just very loudly ask your question?
My question is, the discussion commenced with examining the legacy of Daniel O'Connell, and you did speak as well about the very balanced commemoration of the 1916 Rising. Now, given all of that and your present position as leader of the opposition, and indeed you were a previous Minister for Education, what are your views on the decision to remove history as a core subject?
Yes.
I'm 100% opposed to that. Tell you a small story. In 19...
Will you put history back on the curriculum if you
Yes.
become Taoiseach?
Yes,
Great.
I said that. And but I'm not saying that just to please the audience here. I did it in 97 when I became Minister for Education. There was a proposal at that stage by the NCCA to remove history as a kind of mandatory compulsory subject, and I restored it. And I actually wrote a letter at the time saying this must never happen again, just to get it on the file. But of course it did happen again. And I think we need to engage with the NCCA. And I understand there's a broader educational thought process going into this, but I fear for the future of history. If children don't do history in junior certificate, the numbers doing it in leaving certificate will wither. There'll be no one doing it in leaving certificate. And history is essential to an understanding of our society
Yes.
and our past.
Yes.
And I think it's absolutely essential. I think the great thing of I think we've ended the sterile debates about revisionism versus, I think we've come to a much greater maturity in history where we can be freer to talk about our families. I was able to talk over lunch about, my maternal side being Republicans, my father's brothers being, prisoner of war in World War II with the British Army in Singapore. They all had different politics. The idea that we're all one way and that all families were one way, and that our histories of early era created that. So history is vital to getting the future right.
Okay, but we're just about to end. We haven't had one woman questioner yet. If there is a woman who wants to ask a question, would you put your hand up? Yes. Okay, keep your hand up. Yeah.
We can take one thing at a time.
What?
We can take two or three at one time.
Okay. And there's somebody else down here that we'll get as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Christy. It's not a question really, it's looking for another commitment. If it happens, and who knows what's going to happen about elections, it would be very useful if Fianna Fáil could give a commitment to doing something here to implement a task force that's currently inexistent for Gaeltacht Bhráithig. Unlike all the other Gaeltacht in the country, this is the only one where the population is absolutely plummeting. 1/3 of the townlands in this Gaeltacht area has literally nobody living in them. The school populations are going way, way down. We know it's happening all over the rest of Ireland, but it's happening much, much more strongly here. Aaron Gaeltacht about a year ago set up a task force, and it's been working over the last year and will be publishing very soon. And we're desperately hoping for a commitment at the moment from the current government for somebody to be employed to implement the proposals of this task force. Because if that doesn't happen, the place is just absolutely finished. It's finished in terms of population. It's finished because the young people that are leaving now, as we know, are graduates. They're people who want and who deserve decent jobs, not the ordinary, and I've nothing bad to say about people involved in tourism and so on, but we're talking about decent jobs and proper jobs. That won't happen unless when this task force reports that there is somebody there with vision and properly financed to implement it.
Okay, can I just...
So I'm looking for that commitment.
Okay, can you give her that commitment?
Yes. Because I couldn't agree with you more. The problem is how do you deliver the projects need to be delivered. There's no point having a task force with recommendations that just hang around. Someone has to drive it and deliver it. And where that happened in the past in places like Limerick and other places, it worked.
Okay, and there's a woman with her hand down there. A little bit of positive discrimination going on down here. So I'm sorry to all the men who've not got in. Yourself, yeah.
Thank you. Just following on there from the previous speaker said, looking to the future in the context of your own role, Micheál, in the context of the problem of climate change that's a severe and very real problem, in terms of looking to the opportunity for the future. This area, Cahersiveen, is the home of the weather station and meteorology. I would like to see that there is a commitment to looking to the future and to how we can leverage that to create quality jobs, research and opportunities for the future. And I believe it's here on our doorstep if we can get the political commitment to do it.
Okay.
Micheál?
Well, what I'd love to do is to engage with you and with the local groups and development groups here on agendas like that, because I do believe you have to look at your own inherent riches, if you like, or the advantages that you have naturally, and how can you leverage them more in terms of creating downstream jobs and economic activity. Absolutely.
Micheál, we have to go.
And climate change, by the way, is
Yeah.
not been dealt with in this country.
We
To
have
the
to
degree
go.
that it should, but anyway.
Just a quick question before you go. Fianna Fáil used to be the most nationalist party, the most socially conservative party.
Republican Party, yeah.
Well,
Constitutionally Republican Party.
the most socially conservative party.
Yeah.
What is it now?
It's a constitutional Republican Party, and you know, I won't get into a long history lesson, but I'm a product of Donogh O'Malley's free second level education, along with the presentation order in Turner's Cross in Cork. I think O'Malley and the stuff he did, and Hillary in terms of community comprehensive education, was fairly progressive. I see ourselves as a left of centre Republican Party that believes in individual and endeavour and so on like that. But that's broadly speaking where I see ours.
Micheál Martin, thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.
On behalf of everybody here, I'd like to thank Micheál Martin, and I'd like to thank Olivia for really a very stimulating discussion and question and answer session over the last hour. So thank you very, very, very much. This morning when I was introducing the school, I talked about new friends and old friends. And among our new friends, I'd just like to bring one, to recognise one, a man called Vincent Ruddy, who's here at the school for the first time from Dublin, who's just published this fantastic book about 1843, the repeal year. So I'd like to recognise him over here and to thank him for presenting us with this book. Among our more established friends, I'd also like to recognise Breda Joy. Where's Breda? She's over here, yes. You're not normally so shy, Breda. But anyway, Breda has also just finished her latest novel. Is it Over the Moon? Eat the Moon, right, okay. Which is a novel which is about to be published next week. And somebody told me there during the week that it will be launched on the 2nd of September, and that I should encourage everybody to buy it between the 2nd of November and the 7th of November, or 7th of September, the 2nd of September to the 7th of September, because if you do that, you'll affect the ratings, and it will get a higher profile. So she has an agent who has a head that's very well screwed on. But anyway, I want to recognise Breda and to thank her for her continued support. Also, I'd like also to recognise the Mayor of South West Kerry, whom I omitted to recognise earlier, Councillor Norman Moriarty, who's over here. Who's also an old friend of the school, and of course Sean Kelly, our MEP, who has disappeared, has he? But anyway, Sean is also a great, great supporter. Is he down? Where is he? Right. Anyway, in his absence, let me laud him, let me thank him for his continued support. Sean is a great supporter of ours, has been from day one. He, by the way, will be talking down in the field at 5 o'clock. You know, as part of the school, we have an event down in the local GA pavilion where the greats of the past and the greats of the present in the world of GA reflect on the GAA and its tradition in this part of Ireland. And we're very glad, as I said, that Sean Kelly has agreed to give that short talk. It's only about 15 minutes. The football field is at the other side of the town, just the other end of the town on the right-hand side. I don't know if you can follow that description. Not a very good one, I'm afraid. But anyway, I'd encourage you to go there. That talk is on at 5 o'clock. You're all very welcome to it. Can I again end and close proceedings by... Yeah?
You mentioned GA stars and football stars. Just as a postscript, one of my lasting contributions to this area was, at the behest of the local deputy at the time, John O'Donoghue, was the PE hall in Colashton, Ishkelliga. Particularly large one. Now, I tell you, it rebounded on me as a Corkman, because I can recall about 3 or 4 years later in Crow Park, I happened to be sitting next to the same said John O'Donoghue, and he points to 3 or 4 of the Kerry players. They're there now, he says, because of that hall you built in Colashton. And Cork got hammered the same day, you know.
Okay, well, can I end by thanking you all? I again want to just refer very briefly to what I said this morning, that this committee, which organises and manages this school, is a voluntary committee, so I really think I should recognise the members of our committee. Mary O'Connor, who is our chairperson, who is standing very shyly in the back there. Christy Connell, who is just here, who is our delegate to the GAA. Ruth Barrington, who is here somewhere. Where is Ruth? Who manages our website? Phil O'Neill, who is our ambassador at large, I suppose you call her. And Junior Murphy, who is all of the above. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. I hope to see you tomorrow in Derrynane. Sorry, I've forgotten. I should have also recognised the County Librarian, Tommy O'Connor, who unfortunately couldn't have been here this morning. I should really have stressed that this could not take place without the generous support and accommodations of the County Library and the County Library, the branch library here. So I want to thank Noreen O'Sullivan, who spoke to you first this morning, our sub-librarian, Brendan Casey, and Mary here. There she is. I want to thank you all from for making these arrangements. And also, last but by no means least, most of you will know Kieran McCarthy and his team from FOSS, who really kind of moved the chairs in, moved the chairs out at breakneck speed. As I said at the opening of the exhibition of books last week, there's very little happens in this town, particularly in the area of public services, that doesn't have Kieran's hand in it in some way, shape or form, and it's often unseen, but it is no less important for that. So I really would like to thank Kieran year in, year out for really dealing with and finally, I hope I'll see you tomorrow in Derrynane. The proceedings in Derrynane tomorrow start at what time, Mary? 10 o'clock. And that's not Kerry, that's not in another time zone, by the way. 10 o'clock means 10 o'clock. So we'll be starting at 10 o'clock. So I hope we'll see you there, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you very much.